We're talking about a second book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, this one, The Great Partnership. We're going to do it more or less the same way we did the last one. Rabbi Evan and I will switch off and do a couple of chapters each. So my turn to start this week, and I think Evan will come on board and hopefully jump in here and there. But as you could see probably as soon as you picked it up, it's thicker than the last one that we looked at. The letter in the scroll is a little smaller, little shorter. This is really an ambitious book. It comes from later in Rabbi Sacks's career. A letter in the scroll was one of the first books that he wrote, and this is certainly one of the latter ones. So I see Rich Amond in the chat. Thanks, Rich. It's both, I'd say. It's the title of the book and a reference to our clergy. We do have a great partnership. So, but here the partnership he's talking about is the partnership between science and religion. So, so that's really the idea here. So I said it's pretty ambitious. I mean, Sacks lays out a case for, I would say, modern liberal religion. You know, in his case, it's a modern orthodoxy, and we should always make sure to understand that modern orthodoxy. I mean, you know, we have family that are modern Orthodox. You know, Celan's cousin, who was an attorney for the Environmental Protection Agency, traveled all over the world, you know, doing good work for the environment, while, you know, eating kosher food in places like Bangkok and Vietnam, and you know, relying on the Chabad house wherever he went for kosher food. You know, so it is possible to be Orthodox and be very much a part of the modern world, and that's the kind of rabbi that Jonathan Sacks was. So when I talk about modern liberal religion, I mean it in that sense, right? You can be Orthodox and still be a part of this modern scientific world. Religion, you know, a religion that believes in science and the scientific method, you know, as opposed to what we know from some very, you know, ultra-Orthodox sects within Judaism, and certainly among some evangelical Christians, you know, this idea that the world is really only 6,000 years old, and that the fossil record is just there to test our faith, right? You know, so that we see the fossil record, but we should ignore it, you know, and understand that the Bible, you know, is right and the world is 6,000 years old. So, but at the same time, this modern liberal religion believes that there is a meaning to life. So Rabbi Sacks, in some sense, is rejecting two things. He's rejecting this ultra traditional view of religion, you know, that the world is only 6,000. But on the other hand, he's also rejecting what he refers to often as the new atheists, right? These folks, and I, you know, throw out a couple of names that you may know. Christopher Hitchens, who died a few years ago, was, you know, certainly who was British, and so was probably a particular thorn in the side to Jonathan Sacks, actually. Another one is Sam Harris, who some of you may have studied Sam Harris's little book, Free Will, with me a few years ago. You know, he's, among other things, he's a determinist in the sense that he believes there is no such thing as free will, that everything, from whether or not, you know, to engage in social justice, to whether or not to eat that chocolate bar, you know, is determined by something beyond our choice to be involved. Yeah, Susan, well, I've seen that Ron Reagan commercial a lot lately, right? The Freedom from Religion Foundation, I think, right? So, you know, it might be a question which of these people we have more in common with, those who think that the world is 6,000 years old, or those who think that there's no meaning to existence, in a sense, right? That there's nothing beyond this. So I would say we probably have more in common with Christopher Hitchens and Ron Reagan and Sam Harris than we do with those who um, who believe that the world is 6,000 years old. At the same time, as I mentioned actually when we were talking about the last book, said it's not unusual for people to tell me that they don't believe in God. And I always ask them to tell me about the God they don't believe in, right? Because often people get stuck at a certain place in theological history and tradition, and so they're stuck on an idea of God that is not really 20th and 21st century Jewish theology or any theology, right? So they get caught in an old paradigm, of God is an old man with a beard who sits on a throne in heaven and hurls down lightning bolts at people, right? It's not not what Rabbi Sachs has in mind, nor any other 20th or 21st century theologian, serious theologian. So I want to try and give you a little skeleton key to understanding this book, because it is a little more dense than the one we read. And so I think for me, the key to understanding this book may be on page 45. On page 45, if you have the book, you can take a look. But he quotes the beginning of the Mishnah, which starts with a question. From what time does one recite the Shema in the evening? And this example shows how classical Jewish legal and religious literature is discursive. It goes in all different kinds of directions. So as Rabbi Sachs says about this question, right? The question is, from what time does one recite the Shema in the evening? And goes on, we are not given a law. It doesn't say, from such and such a time. Instead, we find three different views as to what the law is, with no statement as to which of these three is correct or normative. This is then followed by an anecdote, which places the third opinion in the context of an actual event in the life of the person who advocated it, right? So, my reading of this book is that it is much like that style of writing that we find in the Mishnah and then later in the commentary on the Mishnah, which we know as the Talmud, right? So if you read the Talmud on this section of what time does one recite the Shema in the evening, it goes on for pages and pages. And most of those pages, you might say, have nothing to do with what time you should actually say Shema in the evening.
Okay.
So it's instead it's a kind of almost wildly discursive sort of discussion where you have, as Rabbi Sachs points out, several ideas of what the law should be. And the through line is that you are supposed to say an evening Shema. Right? When you're supposed to say it is the question, and the answer is not clear cut. Okay. And so I would suggest that when you're reading The Great Partnership, you recognize that there are many interesting rabbit holes in this text, remarkably interesting anecdotes, fruitful areas to explore. In chapter 2, in just a few pages of chapter 2, we hear about studies on how the East and the West understand the world differently. We hear about feminism in the work of Carol Gilligan and the way women think in a different voice, which was the title of her book, but women think in a different voice from men, kind of a critique which has spiraled out in a lot of different directions, including, medical science. I've seen it, everything about how you set thermostats in offices, that they're set to the temperatures that men like rather than women, to questions about medical research, where the research subjects have been more often men than an equal representation of men and women. So Carol Gilligan's work is really important. But so in the space of a few pages, we see that. We even see Simon Baron-Cohen on the idea that empathizers and systematizers have sharply different skills, even with a note that Simon Baron Cohen is the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, the British comedian. And then we get Jerome Broner on argument and narrative. So all of these things are interesting ideas, but they're used here just as kind of these illustrations of the through lines of the argument that Rabbi Sacks is making. So, so I want to suggest that the skeleton key to understand this book is to find those through lines. I mean, what are the things, what are the ideas that he's setting out? And then feel free to explore any of the rabbit holes you want to, right? You know, any of the different things that he's talking about. I mean, you know, if you haven't read Carol Gilligan or some of these other folks that he brings up, they're very interesting side trips, I'd say. You know, the Mishnah that he brings up on page 45 argues that it is proper to say an evening Shema, and then illustrates many different ways of understanding that concept. So the through line there is that we should say an evening Shema. So I want to suggest a few through lines in Sacks's text. He lays out these through lines a little bit in the introduction, and then illustrates it in the chapters that we're looking at. We're looking at the first two chapters today. So, but on page 2 of the introduction, I mean, one of his through lines that he comes back to again and again in the book: science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. So many of his illustrations are about how that works, right? Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. Both of these functions are important, and one shouldn't dominate the other. On page 6, he says, "It's my argument that religion and science are to human life what the right and left hemispheres are to the brain." Now, a little later, he'll say that, you know, we shouldn't take that left and right hemisphere of the brain thing so, split that up so dramatically, because in fact, some of the functions that happen on the left side of the brain also happen on the right. People with brain injuries to one side or the other can still develop some of the skills that typically are associated with one side or the other. But the important idea there that religion and science we need both. We need both to function fully, right? And so to be completely in one hemisphere of the brain or the other hemisphere of the brain is to lose the great partnership that he talks about from the start, right? That science and religion are necessary to human life in order for us to function fully. So another one of his through lines says on page 9, he talks about hope versus tragedy. He says, a world without religious faith is a world without sustainable grounds for hope. I think this is a very interesting statement. It's you know, one of the classic philosophical positions of the 20th century. You know, we might think of somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre or someone like that, talking about existential philosophy, right? And one of the things that we find among existentialists is a kind of a loss of hope. Things just are, right? We exist while we exist, and we're done when we're done. And you know, is it Albert Camus? I think he mentions actually in the text an existentialist writer and his article on the myth of Sisyphus, right? This idea of pushing the boulder up the mountain only to see the boulder come rolling back down the mountain and have to push it again. That human life, in a sense, is an endless struggle, right? So it's not about hope. It's only about doing the thing that's in front of you. So So I think he, it's not up to Sachs to make that case. That case was made by 20th century philosophers that a world without faith is without sustainable grounds for hope. So, and on page 13, he says, Greece gave the world tragedy, Israel taught it hope. So very interesting. Again, we probably shouldn't make that split so completely dramatically. I mean, he even mentions the book of Ecclesiastes, where the old translation was vanity of vanities, all is vanity, right? A sense of, it's a very Greek book in some ways, the book of Ecclesiastes. And there's a kind of fatalist quality to it, So Israel borrowed from the Greeks the idea of tragedy, and it's not that the Greek world was completely without hope. So a little bit of borrowing back and forth, but it's a very nice turn of phrase, and in a sense we need both. So a person who has faith is one who, even in the darkest night of the soul, can never ultimately lose hope. Right? It's again a powerful statement, right? So that even in dark times, whether it's a time like this, a time of pandemic, or in truly the darkest times, the time of Shoah, right, that there is an element of hope. So. It actually reminds me of a story that the philosopher Emil Frankenheim tells, that when he first moved to Israel, which was back, I think, in the 1950s, and wanted to get a telephone connected. For some reason, it's notoriously difficult to get a telephone connected in Israel. I mean, it still is, even now. Cell phones, everybody's got cell phones, and that's immediate. But if you want to have a landline installed in Israel, so in the 50s, the functionary at the phone company told him that it would be 8 months before he could get his phone connected. Right? Remember, this is back in the time before cell phones. So said, so there's no hope? And the operator told him, you must always have hope. So it's Fackenheim's story that, and he, of course, wrote extensively about the Shoah and those things. And he used this to illustrate that, even when there's no hope, you should still have hope. So, and Rabbi Sachs uses the example that you may know of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl gives sort of the example in his examination of life during the Shoah, that there is, even in the Shoah, that there was something to live for, even when everything else had been taken away. And he tells some of Frankl's stories of talking to people and how they managed to convince themselves that there was something to live for, even in the darkest place in human history. So those are the first two through lines I would suggest that you see. Science takes things apart, religion puts things together. The second one is hope versus tragedy. And the third one I would suggest to you is that the meaning of the system lies outside the system. Right? That would be his third through line, just to think about. And so with that, let me look at the first two chapters a little bit and see how some of these things play out, right? So in chapter 1, he gives us two stories of creation. One of them is the pure sort of scientific explanation, right? Starting with the Big Bang, the explosion of matter in the universe, everything comes into being, right? Cells begin to reproduce, life forms begin to appear, first simple, then of ever increasing complexity, right? So for the first time, something in the universe became capable of knowing that the universe existed, that it might not have done, and of asking, why is it here? Why are we here? Okay? So, and then he tells a second story, right? A second story of creation, where the universe was called into being by one outside the universe, right? And so a transcendent God. I mean, he doesn't use that term here in this in this telling of the story, but it doesn't deny the Big Bang. It doesn't deny the story of evolution, but rather understands that that doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of creator. Okay? It doesn't deny the possibility of a creator, and in some sense suggests that if it's nothing beyond sheer happenstance, then what meaning does it have, right? So so this retelling talks about the one. The one waited to see what would happen next. Eventually, life formed and evolved until one creature emerged capable of communication. And then going on, eventually one man, Abraham, a shepherd far away from the noise of the city, listened to the silence for long enough, intently enough, to discern a message. The message, the one heard the one, right? So which is a lovely sentence, I think. The one heard the one. The second one there is capitalized. So two stories. In one, life is essentially meaningless, right? Which does not deny anything about the science of how the world comes to exist, right? The second one is meaningful, right? So science will always be the thing that tells us how things work, how the world came into existence, how humans came to be, even how the mind develops to a point that it begins to be self-reflexive and understand the idea of a creator, right? The moment where the human being can discern the creator, right? All of this is part of the evolutionary story. And various writers at various times, various researchers studying the construct of the human mind have understood this, right? But once that happens, once the human being evolves to the point of being self-reflecting, then the next stage in the journey happens, and that's a stage filled with meaning. It takes a human being to write these reflective stories, right? We appear to be the only creatures on Earth that can do that have a written alphabet and can communicate with each other in this way, the written word. And while there may be other intelligent animals around, human beings remain unique in that ability to communicate ideas to each other through words. And I think of one of my teachers, Rabbi Larry Hoffman, who was a professor at HUC in New York, talked about how it takes a human being to write the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So only a human being can write a book like that. It's, gazelles may be upset when they're attacked by lions, but they don't write a book when bad things happen to good gazelles. Right? So it's a uniquely human thing to be able to do this. So he tells these two stories, and essentially is asking the question: is it all random, or is there a consciousness at work? And then has to ask, why does that consciousness bring a universe into being? I mean, if there is a God, that doesn't necessarily mean that God will engage in the act of creation. And so, let's see, I think it's page 24. He says that there is only one compelling answer for why God creates the world. He says, out of a selfless desire to make space for otherness, that for want of a better word, we call love. So God wants to make space for something that is, you could say, within God, or a part of God, if you like. But the idea that God is a consciousness that is beyond us and beyond the universe. So, and he takes to task a little bit in this chapter these modern atheists, and asks on page 27, I think it's on page 7, why is despair more courageous than hope? So, and he has a nice little comparison here. Freud said that religious faith was the comforting illusion that there is a father figure. So a religious believer might say atheism is the comforting illusion that there is no father figure, right? So, which of these illusions is better, right? Why should one be considered escapist and not the other? Right? He makes the argument that, to have a father figure, a parental figure, let's say, let's take gender out of this, but, a parental figure requires things of us, right? It requires us to follow some rules, right? It requires us to honor our parents, right? So so that requires something of us. On the other hand, he calls the idea that there is no father figure, that there is no parent, right? He says that's an adolescent fantasy, right? You can do whatever you want, right? Because there's no one saying that you shouldn't. Right? So why? So he doesn't see despair as more courageous than hope. I mean, he doesn't see this idea that you can write all your own rules and do what you want as being more courageous than living a belief-filled life that requires something of us, right? If there's no God, we can do what we like and what we can get away with. Right? That's not, that doesn't seem to be more courageous, just the opposite. Right? So for him, as an Orthodox Jew, I mean, he invests all of the mitzvot with this kind of sense that, right, these are the rules that come to him from a parental figure, right? For us as liberal Jews, we have to think about that somewhat differently. Right? I'd say that, the Reform Judaism in the 19th century always made a distinction between the rituals and the ethics of faith, right? And saw the ethics as being binding, right? And the rituals, like whether or not to keep kosher, were not binding on liberal Jews in the same way. Now, I would argue that I think Reform Judaism has changed some in the late 20th and into the 21st century, and that we now maybe perceive some value in those ritual rules as well, which is not to say that everybody should follow them, but rather that, while we can't really accept that God is so concerned with every mundane aspect of life that it actually matters to God whether I eat a cheeseburger, that's not a God that we really think of in 21st century theology. But at the same time, we have the ability to invest every act with meaning, right? And discipline for its own sake, in a way, is something that may be good for us, right? So keeping kosher may not be completely divorced from the idea of ethics, or lighting Shabbat candles, or putting up a mezuzah on a doorpost, right? All things that probably in the 19th century, the 19th century reformers thought were essentially superstitions that that carried no meaning. But going all the way back to Maimonides says that you put up a mezuzah so that when you enter a room or leave a room, you remember that there are mitzvot that you are responsible for, right? So if the mezuzah is a way to remember as we go in and out of our homes that we have an ethical responsibility in the world, then this ritual commandment is now invested with an ethical meaning, right? So the same could be of any other, purely ritual sort of command. So some Reform Jews keep kosher these days, right? Some wear a tallis and tefillin when they pray. Some pray 3 times a day, right? The Reform movement is a big tent in a sense. And, I think the biggest difference would be the sense that it's not, you don't necessarily keep kosher because it's a commandment in the Torah, but because a certain kind of discipline reminds you of that ethical responsibility in the world, right? So that's maybe a Reform view of what he's looking at here. So let me go to that third through line that I see in the book. The meaning of the system lies outside the system. And one of the examples he gives here is trying to explain the rules of football to somebody. That you can explain all the rules of football. And by the way, football, of course, he means soccer to us, right? Because he's British. But to explain all of the rules of that game is not to explain the meaning of the game. Why you can know all of the rules, but not be passionate about your hometown team the way people here love the Bears, for example, right? How do you explain to somebody that love of your home team, whatever that might be, right? It lies outside of the game itself, right? So it's impossible to really explain to somebody, as 30 years of trying to explain it to my wife, has gotten me nowhere in terms of what sports means to me, right? And why I continue to root for a hometown team that when I haven't lived in that hometown since I was 17 years old, right? So it's a strange thing that can't be explained by explaining the rules of the game. So that's his suggestion, that the meaning of the system lies outside of the system. And then on page 30, he says, only a transcendental God can render human existence other than tragic. So only the fact that something exists beyond time and space, beyond the universe, helps give meaning to our lives here. I also want to mention on page 30, he talks about myth as proto-science. I think this is an intriguing notion to me. Science displaces myth. And I think that's very interesting. Now he talks about it in terms of the myths of the pagan mythologies, right? That all of which seem to exist within the system, and the understanding of God as being outside of the system is how true faith transcends myth. But I'd also point to, I think, the early stories in Torah as a kind of we tend to think of them as myth, but another way to think of them is early attempts at science, right? Early human attempts to explain why we're here and how we got here, right? Attempts to explain, I think, the fossil record. Right? I think about being, I think it's called, something reef in, I believe it's in Utah. It's a national monument. And so you're in the middle of Utah and you're looking at fossilized fish and seashells, right? It's clearly evidence of, the end of the last ice age, when there was an ocean that covered, most of the United States, if not all of it, right? So when people and fossilized fish and things like this were not unknown to the ancient world, certainly to Native Americans, but also in the Middle East, right? So how do you explain finding a fossilized seashells in limestone in the middle of a desert, right? And one of the answers to that question is that you envision a worldwide flood, like Noah in the ark, right? And so the story of Noah's Ark strikes me as being not only myth, but a first attempt at a scientific understanding of what happened in history, in the history of the world. Now that, of course, is supplanted by, our scientific understanding, which comes much later. So you can't live by the myth of Noah, right? And understand that this is how the world worked, but you can understand it as a first attempt of human beings to understand where they came from. And think about the end of the story of Noah, which is the Tower of Babel, trying to understand how is it that there are all these people that we look alike, we're human, but we speak different languages, right? So there's no scientific method to these stories, but they are somehow more than myth too. They're first attempts. It's a first draft of science. Right? So he has this idea that the meaning of the system lies outside of the system. And on page 38, I think he talks about it. It's the end of chapter 1. The meaning of a system lies outside the system. Therefore, the meaning of the universe lies outside the universe. The belief in a God who transcends the universe was the discovery of Abrahamic monotheism, which transformed the human condition, endowing it with meaning and thereby rescuing it from tragedy in the name of hope. So there is only one thing capable of defeating tragedy, he says at the end, which is the belief in God who in love sets his image on the human person, thus endowing each of us with non-negotiable, unconditional dignity. Okay? So that's also what he means when he talks about the meaning being outside of the system. So I want to suggest those 3 through lines to you as you read the book. So I see there's a couple of notes from Andy about the Creation Museum, about what people do when they question the age of the earth, that there were dinosaurs on the ark and were you there, right? This question, were you there? I mean, would call into question anything in history, right? Were you there at the Civil War? No, but it happened, right? So it's a very dangerous path to go down to ask that question about were you there, right? So, and of course, with carbon dating and all of those kinds of things, we know that the age of these bones of dinosaurs, are before the advent of human beings on Earth, right? So there's an absurdity, of course, to their claims. So their only real claim is that, as I said, these things are a challenge to faith. So, God is all powerful. So God can make bones that seem to be millions of years old, right? On an Earth that's only 6,000. Is anything too great for God? Well, it's hard to argue with that, but that's the absurdity of it is pretty clear. So we have just a few minutes left. I'm supposed to get through chapter 2 so that Rabbi Evan can get through 3 and 4. So I think my main points I've already made, which are really about these through lines through the book. In chapter 2, he has so many interesting and engaging things that he talks about. I'm just going to point to a couple. One is where he talks about the two kinds of alphabet, right? Alphabets that have vowels and alphabets that don't have vowels. Of course, the Hebrew alphabet did not have written vowels when it was created, right? The vowels that we know that you maybe learned in Hebrew school that you see in the Siddur, in the prayer book, are a much later edition. They're only about 1,000 years old, when the tradition of Hebrew writing is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 years old. So for all of Jewish history, really, our major texts have appeared without vowels. The original handwritten prayer books didn't have vowels in them. The Talmud has no vowels. The Torah has no vowels, right? So to read a text that doesn't have vowels, he suggests engages a different side of the brain, right? So and makes this statement. I don't know that it's. I haven't done this research myself, but I'll assume that he's right. That languages without vowels are written right to left, and languages with vowels are written left to right, which means that language with vowels is a right brain thing, and language without vowels is a left brain thing, right? And so very interesting idea.
Other way around.
Is it the other way around? I
Yes.
thought the opposite.
No, because the Greek was the left to right, and therefore it was a left brain activity leading to Greek thought. And without vowels is more creative because you have to decide how it will be translated.
Great, thanks, Meredith. Thanks for the correction. So, but it's a very intriguing idea that goes to right to the basis of language itself and the ability of human beings to communicate. So I think it's really fascinating.
Take your guitar out, record it.
The medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan said, right? So the actual writing itself engages a different part of the brain. And so the two ways of seeing the world that he talks about, Athens and Jerusalem, have to do, at least in part, with the actual alphabets themselves. It's truly fascinating. It's also, of course, and I think he brings this up just tangentially, but this book's already a little more than 10 years old, I think. So the way we communicate through the internet is already changing, how we perceive information in a lot of different ways too. So maybe the biggest revolution since the alphabet. So it'll be interesting to see how that works over time, right? But too soon to tell, perhaps. So on page 46, and this is where he talks about how we really need to have both. We need to use both left brain and right brain, right? To ask which is the more important, the right or left hemisphere, is like asking which is more important, the right or left ventricle of the heart, right? So you're not going to survive without both of them. So to live fully, we need both a left brain and right brain. And then the last thing I'll bring up from chapter 2 is on page 55, where he talks about atomization and integration, right? And he gives some ideas about this. And again, part of this is science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. He quotes it again here, what he said back in the introduction. Science is about atomization. You see the word atom in the word, right? Taking something apart to its basic, most basic level, to be able to, see each cell and understand what's happening, even with subatomic particles, right? And then on the other hand, integration is the work of religion, right? To bring all these different things together. And he talks about Niels Bohr here, and uses this thing. Bohr explains the idea came to him when his son had been found guilty of a petty theft. He tried to see his son first from the perspective of a judge and then from that of a father. He could do both, but not at the same time. And that's it. We can switch. We can, when we're in our scientific mind, we get atomization. We understand the science that goes into this, but we also can switch to integration, right? And this is, part of the genius of somebody like an Albert Einstein or a Niels Bohr is being able to go back and forth between atomization and integration. So the fundamental difference, he says, between atomization and integration, explanation and interpretation, between separation and detachment on the one hand, connection and attachment on the other, goes deep into who we are and how we think. And that's what he's going to be exploring as we go on in the next chapters. So, so we have just a couple of minutes. We got started late, but so I just invite any questions or thoughts about the first couple of chapters, or something else that got triggered today as we were talking. I see Steve Moffick's talking about left-handers. Right? What does that mean? Much less laterally. That one half of the brain is much more dominant. Steve, is that what you mean?
No, that distinction between left brain and right brain is virtually absent in left-handers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So there's much more integration, and I'm not trying to associate myself with this, but most of the recent presidents were left-handed.
Yeah, both of my brothers are left-handed. I'm not. I don't know. They're both very smart, very, very talented in very different ways, actually. But it's interesting. Yeah, Joyce?
Just want to mention I have identical twins. One is right-handed and their mirror image left-handed. And they have very different talents and very different manner. And it's interesting to have followed their life, which has both been very successful, but they achieved different paths, is the only way I can put it. And dominant, imagine split, where you get the dominant was the right-handed and the left-handed. So this may be something that our author could have addressed as well.
He goes down all these interesting rabbit holes, as I say, here and there, but I don't think he goes to identical twin studies, but I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about that.
It is interesting.
Joyce, I have identical twin grandsons that are also mirror twins. One is left-handed and one is right-handed. And they have very different personality. They look very much alike. I mean, people cannot tell them apart. The family can, but other people can't. And they have very different personalities, and they're both very smart.
And this is the same case for me.
Sounds like the same thing that you have.
They used to look in a mirror and they would be puzzled because he was thinking he was seeing his brother, but it wasn't.
Right.
It was an image.
Right.
But
No.
the
There's
idea-
a lot of people in the chat. There's a lot of identical twins in the families of this group. Probably more than one might expect statistically. I'm not sure. Meredith, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've talked to me about this book a couple of weeks ago. See how are you finding it these days?
Well, of course, I jumped down the rabbit hole of the left to right and the right to left in the language, and very much realized that part of my attraction, I think, to the Hebrew language has to do with the more right brain thinking. And of course, as a child, I also wrote right to left because I learned Japanese as a child. And but it does have vowels. And so that's a little bit of a difference, but the right to left is certainly something I learned as a young child.
Yeah.
And so I find it very fascinating, and it explains a lot to me of some of the very basic differences between Judaism and Christianity. Christianity having been developed from Greek thought and being very much a reflection, or you might even say a victim of rational thinking.
Yeah, and of course he does make the point, I think, right, that Jesus himself probably spoke Hebrew and Aramaic.
Yes.
And so, while he may have known a few words of Greek, didn't speak Greek, right? And
well,
yet, all
and of course,
books
that
of the
was
Christian
always
Bible are-
my. Excuse me. I was going to say that was always my, or certainly my attraction to studying Torah, was the fact that I felt that one could not really understand Jesus's teachings if one tried to do it through rational thinking, because he in fact was a Jew. And so one had to realize that he was speaking as a Jew and he was teaching Jews. And so that was certainly has been my attraction to Torah study, is that I couldn't possibly understand or interpret Jesus's teachings through Greek thought.
I probably should say, I'm not sure everybody on the call knows you, Meredith, just but Meredith is an Episcopal priest. So just to let you know, who comes to Torah study every week, and most of our other classes as well. So just in case there's someone who hasn't met you, on Zoom here. So, any other thoughts? Okay, well, I think I fulfilled my responsibility of getting through the first two chapters. So Rabbi can go on next week with chapters 3 and 4. So we'll look forward to seeing you back in a week. As I said, if you can remember just one thing from this, try to remember that key to understanding the book is finding those through lines that he's trying to argue. Don't get too stuck in the side road. Well, get stuck in any side road you feel like, but don't think that he's completely shifting the narrative. I mean, he's giving these examples that help explain the through lines that he's trying to get to, I think. Okay. So thanks
you,
everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Time, and tomorrow Real Classics, if you can make it at 2. And tonight we have Rabbi Jill Jacobs speaking for the Tikkun Olam Committee. So she's the executive director of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. She's terrific. She actually spent some time in Chicago where we got to know each other a while back. And so if you're available tonight at 7, the Tikkun Olam Committee would certainly love to see you there.
Unfortunately, those of us in Arizona have now a 2-hour time difference because Arizona doesn't go on daylight savings time.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I have it at 5 o'clock on my calendar. 5 o'clock here. Yeah.
You have to, they would like you to register. It's a different kind of link. So if you do
I
want to go on.
registered.
Yeah, and you
I
have,
did
I know, but if you haven't
Yeah.
registered,
Yeah.
you can click the link to register. So,
Yeah, she's a terrific speaker. So if you have the time, I really highly
Mm.
encourage you to come back and hear her this evening. So, all right, thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.